Are you a victim of domestic violence? No? You know someone who is. It may be you or a friend, but it's such a common problem that you do know someone. I'm Dan Ringer, and we'll talk about domestic violence right now on The Law Works.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting.
The Law Works is made possible by the generous support of the West Virginia State Bar, the Monongalia County Bar Association, and by a major grant from the West Virginia Bar Foundation, promoting public knowledge of the law in West Virginia. The West Virginia Bar Foundation, the philanthropic organization for West Virginia's legal profession and justice system.
Children, men, young, old, everyone. That's a list of potential victims of domestic violence. My guests are Angie Rosser, Communications Coordinator of the West Virginia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and Christine Schneider, a Supervising Attorney with Legal Aid of West Virginia. Angie, Christine, thank you for joining us.
Thanks.
What is domestic violence?
Well, there are two different ways of looking at domestic violence. One is how the law defines domestic violence, and one is just characterizing what is domestic violence in a relationship. And in a relationship, it's a pattern of coercive control. It could be intimidation, threats, financial control, isolation. There are so many forms of abuse, and of course the worst one is the physical abuse, but it can be a lot of different things. And when you look at it as defined in the law, it's 5 things. It could be attempting to harm or actually causing physical harm with or without dangerous weapons. It could be just placing another person in fear of physical harm. It could be harassment, stalking, psychological abuse, threatening acts. It could be sexual assault or sexual abuse. And the 5th one, it could be as defined by West Virginia law, holding, confining, detaining, or abducting another person against their will. So that's the legal definition.
Well, we seem to hear a lot about it, but is there really a problem with domestic violence in today's world?
Unfortunately, there is, Dan. In West Virginia, it's one of our leading social problems. It's our most reported crime that we're dealing with, and it's also one of the most underreported crime.
Wait. That means that we have more cases brought to the attention of the authorities of domestic violence than any other crime, but we're missing a lot of them?
That's true. One of the characteristics of domestic violence is that it's considered a secret or hidden crime. It happens behind closed doors that may not happen in public where it's so recognizable. There's also a lot of social stigma around domestic violence that impedes victims from coming out and feeling safe to disclose the abuse, or feeling like they might be blamed or feel guilty or shamed by what's happening to them.
Well, in my own experience with clients that I have seen talking about issues related to domestic violence, one of the big issues is not fear of what other people would think of you, but fear of being cut off from your ability to live. Not that somebody's going to necessarily kill you, but that how are you going to buy food? Where are you going to live? Because if you point at that person and say, that person's been beating on me, that person's likely to go away or be taken away, and you're left to your own resources.
That's so true. When we ask victims of domestic violence, what are some of the leading barriers to leaving, or why they go back, and often they do go back many times before making that permanent break, economics is one of the things that rises to the top. Those questions of how am I going to afford to live on my own and support my children when I've been so isolated from resources, or have been not allowed to have my own employment or go to school or create that economic security, economic independence that is so linked to my safety and ability to live free from the abuse.
Well, who's likely to be a victim of domestic violence?
Well, I was just going to say about reasons why people stay or go back a lot of times is they have young children. So many victims of domestic violence that I see at Legal Aid are people who have babies to age 10. It's mostly parents of it's mostly parents of young children, and they stay together because they don't want to take the children away from the other parent, and that's something that really can limit their capacity to want to leave.
That kind of filters into what we were talking about before. My situation is dire. I need the support structure that I have, and if I complain about this, if I report, I would say metaphysical, it's not metaphysical, but in practical terms, if I fight back against this, I'm going to disrupt my support structure, and what am I supposed to do? What am I going to do? I suppose there's something you can say that will reassure people and fix that.
Well, we say there is help available, and that's something very important for all of us to be aware of, that around West Virginia, in all 55 counties, there are free services available in terms of advocacy, and we also provide legal assistance, free legal assistance through Legal Aid of West Virginia for victims who have those kind of legal needs. And the other is believing victims and creating trusting relationships. 1 out of 4 women, when we look at women, 1 out of 4 of us will experience violence from an intimate partner at some time in our life.
1 out of 4.
1 out of 4. So chances are that we all know someone who is being affected by domestic violence.
I'm stunned by that figure. What disease, what societal problem would we tolerate if every 4th person was subject to it or suffered from it, but this one?
Right. We're talking about an epidemic. We have this urgency and of something that is preventable, something that can be corrected. There is a lot of research that tells us that domestic violence is a learned behavior. It's a learned belief system that someone feels entitled to exercise power, control, violence over a partner. And we can teach a different way of building healthy relationships, starting young. And that's part of what our work in the coalition is trying to teach young people about what healthy relationships look like, feel like, sound like.
How do you do that?
Well, again, we start young, and we also start with adults who act as role models in the children's lives. And this doesn't have to be a parent. It could be a teacher, a coach, a neighbor, a faith leader, someone they look up to who are modeling relationships that are based on equality, negotiation, joint decision making. These are the kind of relationships that we need to exhibit to our children so they understand that violence is not normal and violence is not healthy and not fulfilling.
What causes domestic violence? Is there a primary cause or circumstances that lead to it, or is it something that's inescapable?
Well, as I mentioned before, it's rooted in a belief system and an attitude. And when we look at the gender dynamics in heterosexual intimate partner violence, where predominantly the woman is the victim of domestic violence, we can look back at history where men have enjoyed positions of privilege and power. People have heard of the rule of thumb. Actually, the rule of thumb comes from English common law, that it was legal to beat your wife with a rod as long as it was no larger than your thumb. So that shows us that through history, this has been tolerated, this has been acceptable. And just recently, in the past 30 years, we've seen attitudes, cultural shifts that are hopefully changing things for the next generation, that violence is no longer tolerable in relationships.
One of the things most people don't know is that in West Virginia, and it's not untrue nationally, in West Virginia up until about 1950, women were the property of their fathers, and then when they married, of their husbands. And when we say property, we mean it just like a table is property or your car is property. It was up to the owner to take care of it or not as he saw fit. Now, we're talking about domestic violence. I know some of you at home are saying, now wait a minute, they're talking about women being beaten up by men, and men are beaten up by women, yes, and we'll talk a little bit about that later, but overwhelmingly the statistics are women are the victims of domestic violence. It does happen that men are, and there are problems associated with that beyond what you might ordinarily perceive. We'll talk about that. But we have to talk about the reality of it too,
Right.
and it is what it is. You work for legal aid and you serve as a contact point. This is not a poverty law issue, domestic violence is.
That's right. For the most part, the clients of legal aid do have to meet financial guidelines. They have to have under a certain level of income, but we have this partnership, not with domestic violence victims, we have a partnership in each of our 12 legal aid offices with each of the 14 domestic violence programs in the state. So together, legal aid covers everyone in the state, and the domestic violence programs are able to cover the whole every geographic area in the state. But how it works is each legal aid office is partnered with their local domestic violence program, and as you mentioned, the financial constraints that's recognized within this partnership, that they don't have to have a certain income level in order to be eligible as a client at legal aid. So.
We're talking about domestic violence. My guests are Angie Rosser, Communications Coordinator of the West Virginia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and Christine Schneider, a Senior Attorney with Legal Aid of West Virginia. I'm Dan Ringer, and this is The Law Works. It is true that there's an economic component to domestic violence, is there not?
A lot of times there is, in the form of financial exploitation, talking their partner into taking out a loan for them, or getting them to put all the utilities in their name if they live together, and then just racking up a lot of debt and having the other person be responsible for it. And there's also having control of all the finances. The person who is the victim of domestic violence often just doesn't have access to the money, or know how, or any knowledge about how much the person makes. They never see it. They could be in a situation where their partner makes $100,000 a year, but they don't know it, and and they're not even able to go grocery shopping for themselves because they're told that they don't know how to handle the money, and so they never see it.
You know, I've run into people, women, who have been told they're not allowed to leave the house. They're not allowed to go to the grocery store. If they go to the grocery store, here's a $20 bill, good luck to you, buy what you have to have. But there's a further economic component, and that is when economic times are hard, tensions rise, and when tensions rise, divorce rates go up, crime rates go up, and violence of all sorts, including domestic violence, goes up. And I suspect it's a result of the male in the family, the husband typically, or if you're not married, the male, feeling as though he's been economically emasculated, and he's trying to exert dominance over somebody, and the best way to be dominant is to whack them around, I guess. Well,
here in West Virginia, like I said, each domestic violence program covers some part of the state, so that in all 55 counties there's a way for a victim to get help, and they can call their local domestic violence phone number, or there's a nationwide hotline. It's 1-877
1-800-799-SAFE is that number, and that will connect people to their local programs. And
1-800-799-SAFE.
That's
SAFE.
right. That's an important number. We hope your viewers will write down, because again, there's someone who we know will benefit from having that number that will connect them with local services. And Dan, you mentioned this time being a time of financial strain, and it is true that we do see an increase in the frequency and severity of violence, and when couples are experiencing this financial strain. Across the board, our 14 shelter programs report seeing a higher request for services in the past few years, and it's more basic needs that need met, just shelter, housing, transportation. And you think of some of our rural outlying counties where transportation is such a barrier. I mean, isolation is part of the domestic violence dynamic, but it is just magnified tenfold when you're talking about someone living up a holler or on a mountain ridge who has no access to the outside world. This is part of the entrapment phenomenon that happens.
We have a map that we can put here on the screen for you showing where the domestic violence programs are in West Virginia. so you can identify perhaps where you can go to get help. We've given you the phone number. It's 1-800-779
1-800-799 SAFE.
SAFE. 1-800-799-SAFE. Write that down. You've got a friend who's going to need that number. Or in West Virginia, because of the partnership between the domestic violence programs and legal aid, they can call their local legal aid office or the next statewide office number. What's that number? The number to our statewide office is 1-866-255-4370. What happens when someone calls that number, they're calling to our Charleston office, and they get to talk to a paralegal about what their legal problem is. And they'll be asked, is there domestic violence in your situation? And if they say yes, they'll be given the local number of the domestic violence program to call that number to first see if any services need to be offered to the caller. Or what services should be. Like, I mean, they could offer group counseling, housing, individual counseling, referrals to other agencies. So the caller will then call their local domestic violence program. Here in Morgantown, it's either RDVIC or HOPE Incorporated, which is in Fairmont. And so what happens then is the domestic violence program advocate will talk to the person who needs help and figure out if it would be appropriate to send a referral to the local legal aid office. And I'm the designated person who gets that here in the Morgantown office. It's actually a 9 or 10 page application that the domestic violence program helps the potential client fill out with information about what kind of property is shared, are there any hearings or any deadlines, how many children do they have, and their names and birthdays. That's actually faxed then to our legal aid office. And then when it's faxed to our office, we set up a file for them, and then I meet with all of the people who are referred one-on-one and decide whether to accept their case for full representation or just offer them advice. And that has to do with a lot of different factors, like the level of domestic violence, what my caseload looks like, and a number of other factors like could the person easily handle this on their own without the help of a lawyer? Are there complicated custody issues or property and debt division issues? Now, there's a tendency to feel like that's awfully, awfully complicated. Don't be deterred by that. We've got help available to talk you through it. We're talking about domestic violence. My guests are Angie Rosser, Communications Coordinator of the West Virginia Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and Christine Schneider, a supervising attorney with Legal Aid of West Virginia. I'm Dan Ringer, and this is The Law Works. I listen to the procedure and I think, I'm depressed, I'm a victim of domestic violence, I'm worthless, I can't support myself, I can't go through that, I just have to put up with it. What do you say?
I would like for people to seek my help when they're absolutely sure that they want to leave the relationship. I don't ever want to say, this isn't right for you, maybe you should separate. I don't want, if I ever sense doubt in an interview with a potential client, I say, wait till you're ready, wait till you're sure, because you're the one who can decide. And so many people, they have a shared bond with someone who's an abusive person, and that abusive person, most of the time, many times, they're so charming and so loving and so friendly, 80-90% of the time maybe, or 50% of the time. And they have a lot of shared memories. It's not easy to break away from someone, and it should never be done if the person or people aren't ready for it. And there will be a time, if it's right, there will be a time when they feel sure of it.
Well, you don't want to encourage the breakup of the family unit. In fact, in West Virginia, we have laws and judicial principles that we encourage the maintenance of the family unit. We promote families. We want people to get married. We want people to have children. But you have to recognize that there may come a time when that just isn't right for you. And if that comes about as a result of a violent situation, your number one concern, your number one action should be to preserve your own safety, and if you have children, preserve the safety of your children. Now, we alluded earlier on in the show that men can be victims of domestic violence also. That does happen.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it does happen, and it's to be taken seriously when it does. It's far less often that the male is the victim in heterosexual relationships, but we do provide services to men often, and we also see male victims in same-sex relationships, of course. So some of the needs are the same, some are different. Christine and I were talking earlier that she serves some male clients who are worried about the safety of their children. And I think, Dan, you brought it right down to the important factor in this, and that it's safety. Regardless of gender, if someone is feeling not safe in their own home, there is help available for those people. And making that first call is a big step. And what we encourage folks to do when they call the hotline, they could just be wanting some information. There's a process of thinking about how to leave an abusive relationship that takes a lot of planning, because it's about being safe. And it's gathering information. What are my options? What are my legal options? If I decide to file separation, what does this mean? What does it mean for my economic support? What does it mean for custody of my children? Critical questions that victims really need to be as well informed as possible before they take those steps. And that's why we're so glad to be partnering with Legal Aid, who is on call to provide that kind of advice and information.
I can't stay in my home. I'm being regularly beaten or I'm being regularly tormented. Again, domestic violence doesn't have to be physical violence. It can be emotional violence. It can be manipulation, control of a variety of sources. And in fact, it can come from a variety of people. West Virginia law defines domestic violence situations as occurring between two people who may have a broad spectrum of relationships. Even if you just formerly dated, and your ex-girlfriend or your ex-boyfriend comes back to cause you difficulties, that's domestic violence. It doesn't have to be husband and wife, or it doesn't have to be significant other, and it doesn't have to be male-female. It can be any combination of those things. You have to be aware of that. You don't have to be impoverished to call these people. It doesn't matter what your family income is. What matters is that there is violence in the situation. Tell me about shelters. What kind of help is available there?
About anything you can think of to help people start over their lives. I mean, I talked to a woman yesterday who had to leave her home with $12 in her pockets and 2 sons under the age of 7. Had no clothes, had nothing she needed. So our shelters are equipped to help families with their basic needs, help them transition as quickly as possible into safe, permanent housing. So we have the emergency shelters. At the same time, we're providing that one-on-one counseling, as well as support groups, programs for the children. We're providing the legal advocacy. We're also doing things like providing educational classes for abusers, and we're also providing monitored visitation centers for families who are required to do supervised visitation or supervised exchange to, again, try to minimize the risk that any further harm would occur.
Christine, there have been some changes of late in domestic violence law and the orders that come out of that, the protective orders. What are the major changes? Well,
they went into effect last year. Now you can get a protective order for a longer time than you used to be able to get it. So when you request from the family court judge to have a protective order in place against the abusive person so that they won't contact you, you can ask for it to be for 90 days or 180 days, so 3 months or 6 months. Now, before it expires, you can have an automatic extension for an extra 90 days. That's regardless of the circumstances. You just ask for it, you'll get it. So it could last up to 9 months now instead of 6 months as a maximum. Also, if there are aggravating factors present, you can ask for it to last as long as 1 year. Now,
what are aggravating factors?
The family court judge has the authority to make that decision. If an aggravating factor could be that the person just won't leave them alone. It could be, it's a broad range of things. The person moved in next door. It could be a variety of things.
Stalking behavior, violations of past protective orders, history of violence. These are things that judges are able to look at more.
But also, if there are if there are material violations of a protective order, the judge now has the authority to grant the protective order for as long as that judge thinks would be necessary. So it could be indefinite, it could be 5 years, it could be 10 years, it could be a lifetime protective order. And that's something that's brand new. Well, it's a year old, but that was the ability to have the protective order last beyond 6 months really didn't exist unless it was in the context of a divorce before.
One of the things that, and I think we talked about earlier, one of the obstacles to getting help if you're in an abusive relationship is just the embarrassment of going in and having people, or the fear of having people look at you and think that you failed in some way. These situations arise over and over and over again in some relationships, do they not?
They do. We talked before about how it tends to come up with the same people. Sometimes they do find themselves in more than one relationship in which they feel victimized.
If you are the victim of domestic violence, male, female, young, old, it doesn't matter, there is help available to you. You can go to the LawWorks website. We'll have links and information about this for you there. You can call Legal Aid of West Virginia. They will help you. You can call your community domestic violence program. It's in the phone book. But do something. Don't put yourself at risk. Don't put your children at risk. Angie, Christine, thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having us.
Dan.
Thank you also for being with us. On behalf of the LawWorks, I'm Dan Ringer. Good evening. If you have a legal problem and want to know if you need a lawyer, you can discuss your problem with a lawyer by calling 1-800-642-3617 Tuesday evenings from 6 to 8 p.m. That's 1-800-642-3617. On the LawWorks webpage at thelawworks.org, you'll find a listing of recent The LawWorks program topics and additional information about this show's topic. If you would like to recommend this program to a friend, you'll find a video of the program at the LawWorks website. You'll also find free video and podcasts of previous programs on YouTube and iTunes. If you would like to suggest a topic for a future program, or if you're a school teacher and would like to receive a free copy of this show for classroom use, send us an email to thelawworks@comcast.net.
The LawWorks is produced in cooperation with the West Virginia State Bar, the Mountain State Bar, and the West Virginia University College of Law. The LawWorks is made possible by the generous support of the West Virginia State Bar, the Monongalia County Bar Association, and by a major grant from the West Virginia Bar Foundation, promoting public knowledge of the law in West Virginia. The West Virginia Bar Foundation, the philanthropic organization for West Virginia's legal profession and justice system.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting.